So now that we've talked about the genderbread person, let's talk about some other areas of demographic diversity, sex or gender identity. And these things are very different. We'll get into those in a few moments. We're going to talk about sexual orientation, age, religion, and you've heard the word privilege. I think it's really advantage, right? We talk about the advantages that people have and not necessarily a privilege, because privilege tends to connote something that I think I'm entitled to versus advantage is simply what somebody else believes I have and that I believe I deserve an advantage. So we'll talk a little bit about the difference between the two and where does this concept of advantage or privilege come from and how it's used. So let's start and get back to talking about sex or gender. I want to be clear that sex is about the genetics that we are born to, the things that are immalleable, our XX, our XY. And this, again, as we've talked about on the genderbread person, is what our body biologically is. But our brains are incredibly different from the genetics of the way our body presents. And gender identity is more about our brains. And what we do know about gender identity is that the brains of people, for example, who are trans women, are more similar to cis women or cisgender women than they are to men or the body that they were born into, masculine bodies that they're born into. Their brains function and light up and process similarly when you look at all sorts of brain scans and things like that. So we know that the brains of trans women are more like cis women, and the brains of trans men are more like cisgender men. So there is a biological basis to gender identity in that it's how our brains think about ourselves. And we do know that the feminization of bodies, of bodies in the uterus, or the masculinization of those bodies in the uterus, that's where the issues come into play. That even though the body develops in one way, the brain develops differently. And this is some advanced genetic stuff. It's not a hard science. I mean, it's not a hard, fast agreement on how these things work, but we do know that the brains definitely light up very similarly, trans women and cis women and trans men and cis men, very similar in that manner. So that's how we can make sure that we understand that there are clear differences between the gender identity that I represent versus what my body is in terms of how it presents. And we'll talk about intersexed individuals in a few minutes as we get to the bottom of the slideshow here. So let me circle back here to talk about sex. And we do know, based on the Bostock decision by the Supreme Court back in 2020, that both sexual orientation and gender identity are protected under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act because of their sex. So whether it is a gender identity issue or whether it is a issue of sexual orientation, we transgress gender norms when a woman loves a woman or a man loves a man. And that's one of the foundational arguments of how they won, that it is a form of a transgression of what one would normally assume would be appropriate female or male behaviors. So sexual harassment is when we harass somebody, right, because of their sex. We've already talked about some of this, I know, in the employment law. Sex harassment is broken down into quid pro quo and hostile working environment. When we treat someone different because of their sex, particularly when it comes to harassing them, you either provide unwelcome attention, sexual attention, unwelcome environment, and employment decisions are made based on your willingness to concede to sexual favors in the workplace. So quid pro quo is have sex with me or I'll fire you, or have sex with me and I'll hire you, or I'll promote you. And it's I will give you something, quid pro quo, and you give me something in return. This is the most egregious. It happens I think it's less prevalent these days, um, given a lot of the education that's going on around there. But we know from the Me Too movement and other things that this is still an issue. It's still a very relevant issue that women experience all the time, that they are asked to conform to sexual behaviors that they are not interested in doing in order to get a job, to keep a job, to be promoted in a job, to just sort of navigate their work lives. Hostile working environment is a little different. Hostile working environment is not necessarily directed at an individual, but it is an environment that is sexually charged, that makes people uncomfortable, whether it's visual cues, verbal communication, whatever the atmosphere is. So, for example, if you put a poster of a naked man on your wall, somebody might be offended by that, male or female. If you have a poster of a naked woman on your wall in your office or in the shop floor, right? People are going to be unhappy about that because it makes them uncomfortable. Telling sexually charged jokes can be very uncomfortable. The goal in hostile working environment isn't that the behavior in and of itself is wrong as much as if someone says stop, you need to stop. But they have to tell you to stop. And if you don't stop, then you are liable for a hostile working environment harassment case. So what we want to see happen is somebody says something that makes you uncomfortable. We turn around right away. We want it to be as proximate to the event as possible and say, that thing that you said this afternoon, this morning, yesterday is unacceptable, and here's why, and I'm asking you to stop. And the person should be able to respond to, gee, I am sorry, I did not mean to do that. My apologies. It won't happen again. Often, though, what people do is they respond defensively, and then that makes them go, I didn't do that. You're just too prudish, too this, too that. And they denigrate the person who's making the complaint. So we want to avoid that. Someone makes a complaint. We listen to the complaint. We agree. We make the change, and we move on from there. If we don't make the change, then the company will come after you for a hostile working environment, or the employee will come after you for a hostile working environment. And the organization is responsible for making sure that that environment is safe. To be clear, it is the organization that is being challenged and the individuals that are perpetrating the harm that are being challenged in the courts. So if you are sexually harassed, I will sue the company for not addressing the sexual harassment if I have made the complaint and nobody did anything. If the company is allowing a hostile working environment to occur, then I will sue the company for allowing that hostile working environment. No matter who is the one putting up the poster, no matter who is telling the jokes, it's the organization that is liable for this. So that's also a really important fact to keep in mind. But we look at cases like Mitsubishi here in Illinois a number of years ago. Mitsubishi had a hostile working environment claims, and some of the women who worked there said, we're not bothered by that at all. So therefore, it's not harassment. And other women said, but we're bothered by it, so it is considered harassment. And so what we start to see is differences of opinions. And all it takes is one person, to be honest, which is problematic, perhaps in some ways, and challenging in others, and correct in another way. The goal is, if a person complains that it is inappropriate behavior and makes them uncomfortable, we're supposed to stop. There is no place for sexual behaviors and sexual language in the workplace. What we do in our private time, what we do in our off hours is fine. But anytime we're at a work-related event, work-related travel, we should not be talking about sexual-related issues. As we move on and talk about sort of this idea of gender norms and gender stereotypes, this is about the gender expression in that genderbread person. And there are expectations for men and expectations for women about how they are supposed to behave. Women are supposed to be docile, they're supposed to be communal, they're supposed to be, they're supposed to not make demands, not be strong and affirming or assertive. Men are not allowed to be gentle and feminine and wear pink or wear purple. They're not allowed to wear makeup, they're not allowed to wear a skirt. And so both sides, men and women, are damaged by stereotypes. because stereotypes are only society's rules for saying that's how I think you should behave. And at the end of the day, the way someone expresses themselves in terms of their gender norms should have no impact whatsoever on their ability to do their job. The bottom line is, if I can do my job and I wear a skirt, great. If I could do my job and I want to wear pants, that's great. Women have a little bit more flexibility, believe it or not, in some ways, when it comes to the way that they can express themselves with clothing, for example, or makeup. They can choose not to wear makeup, even though there have been some women that have been harassed for that, or been challenged for that. But women generally could get away with not wearing makeup. I have not worn makeup in the workplace since probably 1988 or 89. Um, and men, men do. Men get harassed if they want to wear makeup, if they want to wear a skirt, if they want to express themselves in a more feminine way. There's this very rigid expectation about how men should express themselves, and when they vary from that, there is an enormous amount of harassment that occurs because of that. So we want to walk away from gender norms and gender stereotypes, because at the end of the day, if someone can do their job, it kind of doesn't really matter. The goal is that people need to be able to do their jobs no matter what. And if I want to wear pants, I can wear pants. Um, Pregnancy discrimination is also a real thing. This was an amendment to the Civil Rights Act, as we talked about. Um, Anybody who is able to get pregnant, people with a uterus, because we do have trans men who still have uteruses, who do give birth, they gave birth before they transitioned. So being pregnant or being a parent in that sense can still be an issue. We want to make sure we shy away from treating somebody differently because they're pregnant, other than giving them wide berth because of health-related issues, to make sure that they have time to rest because their body is going to be exhausted. So make sure they have a place to put their feet up, that they can relax for a few minutes, that they may be able to take breaks if they have to be on their feet for long periods of time, providing them with a chair if they normally have to stand. So anything that we can do to support a pregnant person would be very important. Um, so Pregnancy discrimination, though, is still a challenging issue for a lot of organizations, and we want to make sure that we are taking care of that. The glass ceiling also is one of those issues that, while we put a highlight on this in the mid to late 90s, in fact, George H.W. Bush, the president, commissioned the Glass Ceiling Commission to investigate why women and minorities were not advancing into the upper echelons of organizations. And they legitimately found that those organizations that are inclusive, that do a great job of making sure everybody has a role to play, everybody's voice matters, they make sure everybody has opportunities. These are the companies that have the greatest success in breaking the glass ceiling, and getting women and minorities into those upper echelon positions. So it's still a real issue, and particularly in a lot of industries, and I've been doing a lot of consulting work lately in the construction field, where we still see women having a hard time breaking into the ranks in manufacturing and construction work. Lastly, in terms of transgender, transsexual, intersexed identities, we've already spoken a little bit about gender identity, but I want to talk about the term transsexual is outdated now. It's included here, but I wanted you to make you aware of it. That the term that we used previously was someone was transsexual was meant to differentiate between somebody who was pre-surgery or post-surgery, pre-hormones or post-hormones. And we really just don't use the term anymore, because someone can identify as transgender even if they're not going to do surgery or have medical interventions, because it's expensive to do that. So somebody who's transgender or transsexual, it means the same thing, but again, we use the term transgender. Intersexed is a link between sort of gender expression, gender identity, and sex, because someone who's intersexed may have ambiguous genitalia that interferes with their ability to identify who that person is. They may have two X's and a Y, an X and two Y's, and that creates a different set of expression. So, and I know somebody who was XXY, and they said, I'm not male or female. I just am. And I express myself more male than female, but I have two X's and I have a Y. So I don't really fit into any category. Other forms of intersexed identity is somebody who may have what we call androgen insensitivity. And what that means is their bodies are genetically male, but their cells do not respond. They're sensitive. They're not sensitive to androgen, which is the male hormones like testosterone and things like that. So they don't express themselves as masculine at all. In fact, their body expresses itself as female, and they don't know that they're intersexed in that manner until more advanced research is done. They recognize they may not have a uterus, and so when they don't get their period by a certain point in time in their life, they might look and do some research and figure out that in fact the person doesn't have a uterus. So they are genetically male, but phenotypically female, meaning how they present themselves, their body presents. Their voices are softer, right? They're not deep like a male voice. They're everything about their features is all very feminine, but they're still genetically male. So that's another example of how somebody can be intersexed. Um, and again, the ambiguous genitalia may come from the body, in its formation. Was never quite clear whether the person the secondary sexual characteristics did not express themselves appropriately. A penis wasn't developed, or a vagina wasn't developed, or breasts weren't developed. So everything is a little unclear as to exactly how that person identifies. In years past, parents used to pick the sex of their child, and they simply raised their child that way. But we see a huge movement now towards allowing the child, you give the child a name, and allowing them to figure out how they identify and how they express themselves. Remember, because gender identity is in the brain, it's not necessarily based on what your body's genetic presentation or phenotypic presentation is. And so the children then, eventually make some peace with how they identify male, female, maybe they as a gender non-binary or something along that line. So just issues to keep in mind. So with respect to sexual orientation, um, we know, number one, because of the Bostock decision, that sexual orientation is protected under the Civil Rights Act. We also know, based on um, Oberfeld versus Ohio, I think, is the case, that they have marriage rights, that it legitimated and legalized same-sex marriage. So civil unions really aren't an issue anymore. That Defense of Marriage Act, which was a big one a long time ago, has long since disappeared. And now it is the law of the land that couples can get married. There are additional laws that have passed. The Respect for Marriage Act was one that was passed recently under President Biden that solidified same-sex marriage rights at the federal level. And he needed to do this because with the overturn of Roe v. Wade, it calls into question this constitutional right to privacy that people have always believed that we've had, because that was the foundation for the Roe v. Wade decision. So ultimately, we want to make sure that those marriage rights are protected, even if this constitutional right to privacy is considered maybe not so clear. So now it is solidified. And what it basically says is, even though states may choose whether or not to allow same-sex weddings, they have to honor marriages done in different jurisdictions. For example, if Missouri, which is very likely to do, says, well, we're not going to allow same-sex marriage anymore, Illinois does, and I don't anticipate that that would change anytime soon. Somebody who was who lives in Missouri could get married in Illinois, cross the border, and their marriage has to be respected as if any other entity, any cisgender or straight couple was married. So those marriage rights are respected no matter what across boundaries. And that is a big issue. That was a big issue before, because if I was married, say in Massachusetts, no place else would respect my marriage rights. I would still not be able to have the right to Social Security. I would still not have the right to spousal benefits, including things like family and medical leave. Let's say my spouse's mom or dad is ill and we need to take leave. I would be denied leave because they were not my family. They were not my husband, not my wife, legally, and the courts would not honor that. So the differences in benefits for people, like if you were in one state where they allowed same-sex marriage, I would have that right there, and I'd move to another state, and even if I'm working for the same company, the company would not offer me the same benefits as a spousal situation. And so those inconsistencies in application made it really challenging for people in same-sex relationships to get consistency in the kinds of benefits that they could expect. So the goal, of course, is that we want to make sure that we've got some consistency for all of our employees, no matter what. So let's talk a little bit about that downside of living in the closet. And when we think about, is it, does it matter about who someone's partner is? I mean, here, at the end of the day, nobody's going to sit at home or sit with their work colleagues and give explicit discussions about their sexual behaviors or what they do in their bed at night. The bottom line is, I want to be able to talk about my spouse, about the vacation that we went on, the garden that we put in, the new car that we bought. And if I say my wife and I, and someone might turn around and say, look, I don't care if you're gay, I just don't want to hear about it. The problem is that that's inconsistent. And I know from the research that I've done on these particular topics, when someone has to hide a part of their identity, whether it's they're gay or lesbian, whether they're disabled, whether they have a disease or an illness, this is across the board in all different areas where there are hidden stigmas attached. People feel uncomfortable being able to express themselves, and that interferes with their ability to give 100% of themselves to their job when they're there, because they spend so much time preoccupied with hiding their identity, hiding the pronouns that they use when they refer to their spouses. They protect themselves, and that occupies the limited computing power that our brain has. For those of you that have had MBA 522, we've talked about the frontal cortex and the amount of information our frontal cortex can process at any given time. But the goal is that when we are preoccupied with hiding ourselves, we eat up some of that computing space that our frontal cortex has. So instead of being able to hold 5 to 7 pieces of information, that might occupy such a big chunk of our working memory that we can only handle maybe 2 or 3 pieces of information, or maybe 3 or 4 pieces of information. So we are interfering with someone's ability to bring their whole selves to the workplace. And if they can't bring themselves to the whole workplace, this is a concern. They aren't able to be the best worker they can be. When employees are given the freedom to be themselves, to talk about their spouses, to talk about their vacations, to talk about different things in the workplace, we absolutely see greater success and greater performance from them in the workplace. Less stress for them, more mobility, because now I can move from company to company, position to position, and I don't feel so constrained by this idea that I can only stay here because this is the only company that's going to give me benefits, or it's the only company that lets me be my true authentic self. Authenticity is so important when it comes to any human being, regardless of their orientation, and regardless of their disability status, regardless of their race. People need to have the freedom to be their authentic selves. If I want to put a picture on my desk, I should be able to put a picture on my desk. If I want to talk about my vacation, I should be able to talk about my vacation. I should not have to censor myself, or people who are transgender shouldn't have to censor themselves because somebody else is uncomfortable. So it's about educating ourselves. It's about learning. It's about recognizing that I should have as much right to be myself as I can be. Now, there are challenges, of course, when it comes to sexual orientation and religion. And how do we reconcile this, right? Organizations certainly have the right, and religious organizations certainly have the right to make decisions about what they believe to be appropriate or inappropriate based on their religion. But in the workplace, your religious rights, you might say, well, it's against my religion to work with someone who's transgender. I call foul. There is no religious rule that says you may not interact with someone who is a different sexual orientation from you or a different gender identity from you. There isn't. I've read the Bible. I've gone to Bible school. I know I've 16 years of Catholic education. Regardless of what the Catholic Church says about this, at no point in time have I ever read where it said it's against their religion to interact with somebody and to work with somebody who is a different orientation or different gender identity from you. So it's religious expression is not an excuse to illegally discriminate against somebody in the workplace. It's okay to say, my religious organization, I won't hire somebody who's transgender because that's against my religion. Okay, that's a separate issue. But if I am in a private organization that's not religious, and this person is gay, this person is straight, and that straight person doesn't want to work with the gay person, this is a problem. And this is something that we need to make sure it's really clear. People, it's not illegal to be gay. It's not illegal to be transgender. People have the right to express themselves as they want to. And our job is not to be controlling our employer's environment. Our job is to do the job that we've been hired to do, to interact with the people that we need to interact with to get our job done. There are a lot of things that I don't like that people do, but that doesn't stop me from interacting with them. You know, I don't drink a lot. I don't do drugs. And you could say, well, it's against my religion to be with somebody who drinks alcohol. And that's not true. It's not against my religion. It makes me uncomfortable maybe, but it's not against my religion. And so I caution people to just be really careful about how we use that. Be really clear what your religious beliefs tell you to do. It doesn't mean that it tells what everybody else should do, because there are so many different religions out there with so many different perspectives. And, I think it's important for us to respect religious differences, but also just because you and I are a different religion doesn't mean that we cannot work together. Just because you and I have different religious beliefs doesn't mean that we can't work together. So age is also a big issue. Ageism becomes a general problem for us because in our culture, we don't really value older workers and older humans in general. We often don't see three-generational households where children and parents and grandparents all live together in the same house. In some cultures, yes, but not really here as a rule in the United States. We often shuttle our elderly off to nursing homes and really don't respect them in the same way that we respect younger folks. So it is important for us to recognize that older workers have good things to contribute. We should be judging people not on their age, but on what they are able to do for us. Just like I would tell you, we don't want to judge people based on their orientation. We judge them based on what their ability is to do. We don't judge people based on their race. We judge them on their ability to about what they can do to get their job done. And it's the same thing for older workers. I've known plenty of non-traditional older workers who totally belie this notion that older workers are slow or resistant to change. They're not. Many of them embrace change quite readily. I'm 60. I love change. Change is fun, So, I mean, if you were to look at me and say, oh, she's got gray hair and she's 60, therefore she probably is not going to be willing to embrace this thing. I'd be like, you'd be wrong, because I'm all about fun and exciting new things. I like change, and I'm willing to embrace change when I find it valuable. I mean, and I wouldn't say that I embrace all change, because there are a lot of times I don't need to change because what I'm doing serves me right. But that doesn't mean I put a barrier up to stop other people from doing what they need to do, and change the way that they need to. They offer really unique KSAOs, knowledge, skills, and abilities, to the organization. They have deep levels of experience, deep levels of expertise. They have knowledge, and why would we want to throw away that knowledge? It's a stereotype that older workers cannot do this work, and so we should be thinking twice about how we handle that. And of course, again, we've already talked a little bit about multi-generational workforces in the very first lecture. Adding in our Gen Z at the bottom there. These multi-generational workforces are really key. They really can make a difference um, in in how we learn from each other and embrace different perspectives and points of view. I think age is a great proxy for different experiences and different perspectives, just as we talked about some of those defining events for each generation. What defined the traditionalist was the Depression. Totally doesn't define my experience at all, because I can't relate to it, and neither can my Gen Z children. They can't see that, and they don't recognize it and embrace it at all. So it is important that we not judge anybody in either direction about their ability to do the job. We allow for differences in perspective, differences in attempts to try to do something, and different points of views and experiences. Tying into our discussion from before about this boundary between sexual orientation and religion, it's important to know, as I said, that not all religions believe that being gay is inappropriate or a sin. Many religions have no issues with this. The latest religion that's grappling with this is the United Methodist Church, which is now splintering between the UMC and the Global Methodist Church, which will stick with more traditional perspectives when it comes to same-sex priests, same-sex ministers, same-sex relationships, same-sex marriage, and the United Methodist Church is starting to embrace being more inclusive of the LGBT community. Religion is an important part of everybody's identity, no matter what your faith tradition is, and that needs to be respected 100%. Some people, like Muslims, need to pray multiple times a day, and creating a safe space for people to do that is a way of embracing and accepting religion. And there was a Supreme Court case this year. I don't remember the name off the top of my head, but there has been a recent Supreme Court case that said organizations need to be accommodating of religious differences, particularly when it comes to staffing on days of rest. For some faith traditions, Saturday is the day of rest. Like people who are Jewish, people who are Seventh-day Adventists, they embrace Saturday as that day of rest, whereas Christians are focusing on Sunday, and Sunday is our day of rest. Um, and so, because there are differences in this can create challenges for scheduling, and how do we handle holidays and work schedules. Right now, it's if as we approach the fall semester, and if you are Jewish, you have high holidays that you need to make sure that you can accommodate. And the high holidays are things like Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, and Yom Kippur, which is the Day of Atonement for people who are Jewish. Ramadan is a month of fasting that happens, and it rotates around the calendar. So there's no guarantee that Ramadan is in maybe September this year, but it could be in August the next year, and July the year before that. It rotates around the calendar because it functions off of a different calendar than the Gregorian calendar that we're used to here in the United States and most traditional groups embrace. So, because it works off of a different calendar year, it's a rotating holiday, like Yom Kippur and Rosh Hashanah, like Passover, like Easter, like our Easter rotates, and usually Easter rotates so it's in alignment with Passover, right? Because they're related to each other religiously. Um, but we do need to make sure we create and offer a safe space for people to express their prayer and religious convictions, but we don't want to impose that on everybody. There are people who choose not to pray at work, and they don't want to pray at work, nor do they want to be told they need to pray at work. So if people want to pray before a meeting or pray before a difficult, challenging decision needs to be made, that's a private thing. And that's great, but you need to warn people so that people can choose to participate or not, that people have the ability to walk away if they don't want to engage in those practices. But we do want to respect that if people choose to pray, they're allowed to pray. No one's stopping them. It's when the organization mandates it that's a problem, right? Um, Honoring different holidays, we have to take people on their face value when they say this is a religious holiday and I need time off. We don't have the right to basically say, prove it that you're a observant Jew, or that you're an observant Muslim, or that you're an observant Hindu. Prove it to me that you are. We can't ask someone to prove that. If they tell us that they are a certain faith and these are the days that they need to be accommodated, we need to do that. There are all sorts of religious minorities out there. There is a presumption, of course, that the religion that most people are Christian, and that may or may not be true, but that is the presumed majority group here in the United States. Now, if we were in Saudi Arabia, we wouldn't make that presumption, right? We would make the presumption that you were probably a Muslim. But there are many groups that are marginalized religiously, that we should be aware of, that we're not discriminating against, and that's people who are pagan or practice Wicca. I mean, these are not people who are devil worshippers, right? Even Satanists are not devil worshippers in the sense that Christians think about them in that way. People who are Satanists believe in a different set of beliefs, and they honor Satan, which is about accountability for behaviors and things like that. I won't get into the nuances of it, but I want to be clear that pagans and Wicca are not necessarily quote unquote devil worshippers. They don't eat the heads off of chickens and run around killing people and putting curses on people. They are nature worshippers, and they believe in the power of nature and the interconnectedness of nature, and how we are connected to each other. Sort of like that butterfly effect. The butterfly, flaps his wing here, and how does it affect the rainforest in South America, kind of thing. That's the principal basis for pagans and Wicca. Hindus and Buddhists, again, they are also groups that have, temples that they go to, they worship, and their worship schedules and their holidays are very different than those of Christian faith. Muslims also, Jews also. These are groups that are Abrahamic in their style, but they have different variances in the way that they see things. Obviously, Muslims are broken down into Sunni and Shia. There may be others like Sufis and things like that, which I won't get into, but Muslims, generally are broken down into two groups: the Shia and the Sunni, and they don't like each other, which was some of the big internal issues that were going on in Iraq during the Iraq War. How those groups were fighting each other all the time. And then we add to our religious minorities people who are non-religious or atheists. They don't like religion. They don't embrace religion. And we need to respect their beliefs and values as we do everybody else. They don't have the right to tell me I can't express my faith the way I want to. Alternatively, I don't have the right to tell them they must believe, they must pray, they must do things the way that I do. We have to be religiously pluralistic. We have to respect everybody's faith traditions, how they manage them. And when we do that with an open mind, without judgment, we will find that people will feel more comfortable and accepted in the workplace. People don't want to have to hide that they are not a mainstream Christian religion. They want to be able to express their religion the way that they want to. And it's a good thing to learn. It doesn't mean that it's going to change your mind, but it's important to learn what Hindus believe, what Buddhists believe, what Muslims believe, and understanding that. Now, Perhaps that's my biased opinion. I will admit that entirely because I'm a Unitarian Universalist. And Unitarian Universalists believe that there are multiple paths of faith to get to the divine, to get to what people call God, um, and that there are multiple ways to get there, and that's okay. And and so I think that that probably does drive a lot of my point of view around religious pluralism and the desire for people to understand each other. I see great value in understanding what Christians believe, what Muslims believe, what Hindus believe, what Sufis believe. I want to learn more about it, not because I want to convert, but because I want to understand that because it enriches my life to understand what you value, what matters to you, and then I can be respectful of that for you. Lastly is this concept of privilege or advantage. We use the term privilege or social privilege when we're trying to acknowledge that there are some groups that have greater advantages than others. But people really resist that term privilege because it does, as I said before, connote that I am entitled to something. And really what we mean by privilege is really societal advantage. We know, all things being equal, that if I had the choice between a male candidate and a female candidate, unconsciously, I am far more likely to hire the male candidate than the female candidate. You might say, oh, I would never do that. Well, let me explain how that works. I did a study a number of years ago with my friend, and we asked people to evaluate a resume. The resume was identical, regardless of the name on it. The resume was absolutely identical. One resume had a male name, one resume had a female name. And so we randomly assigned people to one of two conditions. They either looked at the male resume or they looked at the female resume. And then we asked people, after they looked at the resume, tell us a quick assessment. How qualified do you think this person is? Sort of a representation of a quick snap judgment that we make when we first look at a resume. Now, this is particularly relevant for you because you're going to be looking at a metric ton of resumes as we get to data later on. You're going to be able to see resumes, to learn information about them, and to be able to make those hiring decisions. All right. So I want you to be mindful of this as you get into this. So what happened was we asked them that question: how qualified is this individual for the job? Those that evaluated the male resume, and that was men and women both, evaluated that resume of like a 4.2 out of a 5. But when we asked them to evaluate, we asked the group that was going to evaluate the female resume that same question, they evaluated that female resume like a 3.9 out of 5.0. It was a significantly different, statistically significant difference between how the male resume was evaluated and how the female resume was evaluated, even though the job description was really clear. It wasn't a gendered job description, and the resumes were identical. The only thing that was different was the name on it. How do you justify that? Where does that come from? You and I would both sit here and tell you, I would tell you as a woman, I would never intentionally discriminate against a person who because of their sex or their race or anything else. That's what our job is as managers, as HR professionals. Yet, there's unconscious bias that influences the way that we see things. And it's that unconscious bias that comes from society's messages that tell us, even unconsciously, we're not aware of it, that the male would probably do a better job than the female. I have a friend of mine that has a rather ethnic-sounding name. Her name is Tisha. She's white. But when she sends her resume out there, she doesn't always get the same response as people with less experience than her in the job market, because people assume it's an ethnic name, so she must be, some different ethnicity, some different racial group. Oftentimes she's presumed to be black when she's not. And so when we do these sort of studies, when we deal with ethnic names, the same results pop up, that men and women, ethnic groups and majority groups, they are treated differentially based on unconscious bias. And that's a challenge for us. We have to be made aware of our unconscious bias, which is why your assignment for this module is going to be the implicit association project. I want you to be thinking about how do we make a judgment about someone? What are some of the unconscious biases that are attached to us? And how do we make ourselves more mindful and overcome this? Because here's the great thing that we learned in our study, aside from the fact that men and women were treated very differently regardless of how qualified they were, that men were considered more qualified than the women no matter what, except when we asked them to dive in a little bit deeper, to get background information and do reference checks and figure out, tell me a little bit more about this person. And the person says, oh, they're a great candidate. I know this about them. I know that about them. Here's some great examples of some good things that they've done. So obviously you want somebody who's going to give you a good reference to do your reference check. So the same information was available in the reference checks regardless of whether it was a male resume or a female resume. And lo and behold, when we asked them at the end, so how qualified is this individual? The male stayed fairly steady state. The male resume was steady state. It was pretty much no different than it was initially and the initial reaction to them. But the resume with the female name on it, the perceptions went from low to comparable to the male resume. So their perceptions of their qualifications increased by getting the extra information. So that extra information helped us to leap that gap between the male versus the female. So I can go on to that about this for hours, and I know that you don't want to sit here for hours listening to me talk about these things, but it's important for you to know that there are groups that have advantages. There are height advantages. Did you know that most presidents and CEOs are over 6 foot tall? You might say, well, what difference does that make? The problem is that the average female height is about 5'5", 5'6". The average male height is about 5'8" or 5'9". So why are more leaders, presidents and CEOs, more likely to be over 6 foot tall? That's an unconscious bias. That's society saying that there's an advantage to being tall. Tall means you're a better leader. Now, we know there is absolutely no relationship, statistically speaking, between height and ability to lead. But nonetheless, we as a society said there's an advantage to being tall. So that person is tall, they must be a good leader. It's not true, but that is exactly the way we think about these things. So there's another example of privilege, height privilege, advantage that happens because society says tall people will make better leaders. And we all know that that's not necessarily true. So we need to check, our assumptions about people. We need to recognize that this notion of advantage or privilege is really about the unconscious associations that are being made about someone's abilities to do what they need to do.